Chapter 16. Nancy's Masquerade. Nancy was escorted into Dr. Stackpole's private study, where she found him nervously pacing the floor. "Ah, I am glad that you have arrived early," he said in relief. "To tell you the truth, I am beginning to wonder if we have made a wise move in inviting Mrs. Allison here. Something may go wrong. Then serious consequences could result if we have made a mistake." "But she's guilty of kidnapping, Dr. Stackpole. The documents in our possession prove that, and she is a thief as well." "Yes, that is so. But if Mrs. Allison suspects that her true character has been exposed, she may resort to violence. I am afraid for your sake, Nancy." "I'll be on my guard," Nancy promised. "Just show me where I am to hide." Unwillingly, the elderly man led her to an alcove just off the study, which served as a tiny solarium. It was filled with palms and potted plants, offering an excellent hiding place where Nancy could hear and see everything without being detected. She chose a nook behind a large pottery vase. The girl had just secreted herself when the doorbell rang. Dr. Stackpole hurried to answer it. He was utterly unprepared for the sight that greeted his eyes. Mrs. Allison was wearing a long, flowing white costume and turban, and carried a jewel-bound book in her hand. She entered as if walking in a trance. This way," the professor stammered, moving toward the study. He offered Mrs. Allison a chair, which she ignored. She stared at her host with a glazed expression. "You are interested in mysticism," she murmured, before the dazed professor could speak. "We are, I believe, of one spirit in this matter. I shall read that we may find communion together." With one arm outstretched in a dramatic gesture, Anita Allison began to read from the jeweled volume. Nancy knew by the blank expression on Professor Stackpole's face that the man was too stunned by the exhibition to comprehend a word. But by the time Mrs. Allison had finished the passage, he had recovered his usual poise. "A beautiful quotation, Mrs. Allison," he said. "But our time is short, and we must talk of India." "Ah, yes," the woman sighed. "India, the land of adventure and mystery. What tales I could tell of its glamorous rulers." "Perhaps you could tell me of Ayama Togara," Dr. Stackpole suggested cautiously. "I fear the stories that filter to us in the West are but half-truths." "The real story of how Ayama Togara became a great power has never been told," Mrs. Allison boasted. "You would not believe me were I to say that I aided in making him both maharaja and governor." "Indeed I would," Professor Stackpole answered. "The untimely death of a maharaja's heir, a boy named Rishi, left the community affairs of the province in a hopeless muddle," Mrs. Allison explained sadly, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I was deeply grieved over his demise." "I can imagine you were," Nancy thought scornfully. "Rishi's mother died of a broken heart, and his father emigrated to a foreign country when a near revolution among his workers started. One thing led to another, and the entire province was plunged into turmoil," Mrs. Allison continued. "I knew that someone strong would have to be found quickly if war were to be avoided. I decided to act. You understand that I was motivated entirely by my desire to aid the poor people." "Oh, certainly," Professor Stackpole murmured, trying to hide his contempt for the woman. "Through various political and psychic connections, I was able to place Ayama Togara in power." "And your reward?" Dr. Stackpole inquired. For the first time, Mrs. Allison regarded him with a slight trace of suspicion. "Nothing," she answered shortly. I did it because of my warm feeling for India." Professor Stackpole encouraged her to reveal more. As it became apparent, however, that she was regarding his interest with distrust, he switched to another subject. He spoke of a certain type of carved Indian vase that had intrigued him. "I have tried to buy such a vase at various art stores," he remarked, "but I can't locate one that pleases me." Mrs. Allison nodded understandingly. "I know exactly the sort of work you mean, and it is difficult to obtain. I have a friend, though, from India, who might be able to find the vase for you." "You are very kind. I don't suppose your friend could be a man named Rai?" Again, Mrs. Allison regarded the professor suspiciously. "Certainly not," she replied stiffly. "I have never heard of him." By this time, it was evident to Nancy that Mrs. Allison was entirely too wary to say anything that might involve her in the scheme to deprive Rishi of his rightful inheritance. More drastic methods would have to be employed to compel the woman to confess. The girl detective slipped quietly through a window and walked around to the front door. She rapped. A maid promptly answered and led her into the library. Immediately, Nancy took a deep breath as she entered and apologized for intruding on the pair. "We were just having a pleasant little chat about India," Dr. Stackpole said. "Mrs. Allison is considered an authority on the subject of mysticism." "How interesting!" Nancy exclaimed. "I've always been deeply intrigued by that subject myself. In fact, some of my friends believe that I have psychic powers." "Indeed," Mrs. Allison remarked. "Yes," Nancy continued glibly, "I have always felt that I had the ability to look into the past. Under correct conditions, I have faith that I could demonstrate this strange power." "Psychic powers are far more rare than you think," Mrs. Allison said unpleasantly. "Nevertheless, I am certain I have them. If you wish, I will prove it." The woman hesitated. Then, before she could speak, Professor Stackpole said quickly, "By all means, Miss Drew. Such a demonstration should prove interesting." "Lower the blinds," Nancy requested. When the room was shrouded in semi-darkness, she said to Mrs. Allison, "I must have your turban." "This is nonsense," the woman complained, as she unwillingly gave up the round, banded silk hat. After placing herself in front of a dark velvet drapery, Nancy closed her eyes. She began to rock slowly back and forth, chanting in low, musical tones. At first, her words were unintelligible. Then she began quoting passages from the documents she had taken from Peter Putnam. Mrs. Allison leaned forward, gripping the arms of her chair. Her eyes dilated with fear. She tried to speak, but made only a choking noise in her throat. Nancy knew it was time for the climax. She took a step toward the woman, and her hand swept outward in a gesture of accusation. "You are the guilty person," she proclaimed. "You deprived Rishi of his right to become a maharaja and brought him to this country. Confess! Confess!" For an instant, Mrs. Allison seemed too stunned to move. Then she dropped down to her knees before Nancy, sobbing wildly. Yes, I did it. I employed Rai to kidnap the boy so that Ayama Togara might be put in power. I did it for India." "You kidnapped Rishi because your reward was a precious treasure," Nancy corrected sternly. Before Mrs. Allison could reply, there was an unfortunate interruption. A telephone rang in the adjoining room. Mrs. Allison straightened. The look of fear left her face, and she became composed. "I must answer," Professor Stackpole murmured as the ringing continued. Nancy realized that the spell was broken and expediently emerged from her trance. She had secured the confession she wanted. The professor would serve as a reliable witness against Mrs. Allison at the proper time. "Well, did my psychic demonstration convince you?" Nancy smiled. It did. I don't suppose you remember much of what you said? Nancy was not compelled to reply, for Professor Stackpole appeared in the doorway just then. The call is for you, Nancy. Your father wishes to speak to you. Nancy hurried to the telephone. What is it, Dad? She asked. I really shouldn't have bothered you, the lawyer apologized. I merely phoned to learn if you're safe. Since you left, I've been worried. By the way, Ned was here looking for you. I'm all right, Dad. Everything is going great. Only I can't take time to tell you about it now. I'll call you back in a few minutes. Nancy cradled the phone and returned to the library. She paused in the doorway to stare in horror. Professor Stackpole lay stretched out on the floor, unconscious. His head was bleeding from a deep wound. Mrs. Allison had disappeared. End of chapter 16.